Opening prayer. Opening prayer. Maybe if he shows up, he can. Kyle. Good evening, all. I'm getting the signal that it's time to begin. So. Any additional word on Donald today? Donald's family arrangements, funeral arrangements? Anyone? Okay. Please remember Lynette and her family. Ken, he's ongoing treatments and recovering. Also, Bridget Johnson, Becky Tyree, Patricia Forrester. Patricia was here this morning and sure did look good. Bill Stiles, Donna Reeves, Lane. I'm not even going to try. Garen Halterman, Pam Stokes' mother. Also, Mott Coleman, Betty Barnett, and Ken Hasty. Also, remember Barbara and Mary as our shut-ins. Any other announcements we need to make this evening? Any at all? Okay. With that, let's go on into our song service. Stamper and I are going to tag team it unless others show up. So if you would, turn to 294. 294. You're the one. Lord, the people praise you. Lift you up and praise you. For you are the Holy One. You're the one, you're the only one. Lord, the people love you. Place nobody above you. For you are the Holy One. You're the one, you're the only one. Sing holly, holly, hallelujah. All the glory is due you. You are the Holy One. You're the one, you're the only one. Bless your name, Lord Jesus. Bless your name, Lord Jesus. Holy name that frees us. Holy name that frees us. You are the Holy One. You are the Holy One. You're the one, you're the only one. We will praise you right here and now. We will praise you right here and now. Bless the hills and rocks cry out. Bless the hills and rocks cry out. You are the Holy One. You are the Holy One. You're the one, you're the only one. You're the one, you're the only one. Holly, holly, hallelujah. All the glory is due you. For you are the Holy One. You're the one, you're the only one. If we had 10,000 hands, we would bless you as you command. You are the Holy One.
You're the one, you're the only one. If we had 10,000 tongues, we will bless you with every one. We will bless you with every one. You are the Holy One. You're the one, you're the only one. You're the one, you're the only one. Holly, holly, hallelujah. All the glory is to you. All the glory is to you. Oh, you are the Holy One. You are the Holy One. You're the one, you're the only one. You're the one, you're the only one.
Next song will be number 827. Number 827.
Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, that calls me from a world of care, and bids me at my Father's throne, make all my wants and wishes known. In seasons of distress and grief, my soul has often found relief, and of this day the tempter's snare I thy return. Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, thy wings shall my petition bear. To him whose true and faithfulness engage the waiting soul to bless. And since he bids me seek his face, believe his word and trust his grace, I'll cast on him my every care and wait for thee, sweet hour of prayer.
Opening prayer.
Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for allowing us to gather here today and worship you in some gracious name. I thank you for Kenny and Drew and their ability to get up and lead us in songs. As we clear our minds, all our worldly thoughts, and focus on Garrett and his lesson, we can apply to our daily lives. Be those on the prayer list, and be with those who are not with us here at this time, and just ask you help us focus on what we're doing here tonight. Be with us as we go to the men's meeting, the business meeting tonight, and help us do the will of you, for your church. In Jesus' name we pray.
Next song will be number 754. 754.
Faith of our fathers lay still, in spite of dungeon, fire, and sword. Oh, how our hearts beat high with joy, with every dream that glorious word. Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death. Faith of our fathers, we will love, both friend and foe, in all our strife, and reach thee to as love us out, by kindly words and virtuous life. Faith of our we will be true to thee till death.
Song for the lesson will be number 643. 643.
Are you sowing the seed of the kingdom, brother, in the morning, bright and fair? Are you sowing the seed of the kingdom, brother, in the heat of the noonday's flare? For the harvest time is coming on, and the reaper's work will soon be done. Will your sheep feed many? Will you garner many for the gathering at the harvest home? Are you sowing the seed of the kingdom, brother, all along the fertile way? Are you sowing the seed of the kingdom, brother, you must reach at the last great day? For the harvest time is coming on, and the reaper's work will soon be done. Will your sheep feed many? Will you garner many for the gathering at the harvest home?
Invitation song will be number 381. 381.
Good to see you here. Good to be here. Thankful that you're here. Thankful for our topic tonight, not because I chose it, but just because of its importance to us as Christians and the fact that we need to be people that are searching and desiring and loving the idea of spiritual growth. It is something that we as the people of God are called to do, as we found out this morning. We looked at that and presented that argument, the fact that we are called to grow closer to God. And if we are not getting out of our comfort zone, then we are not growing closer to God. And so we learned about really the need for that. And I told you that the next few lessons, the rest of this month, will be the idea of practical ideas under this idea. And I presented this chart here. And again, it's not just getting out of our comfort zone and into this fear zone, as it's been titled there, but that seems to push us back in, but stepping past that and into the learning and ultimately the growth zones. And something that I had mentioned to someone after services is I forgot to mention this morning that as you get out of the comfort zone and go into those growth zones, it's very possible and I think likely that your comfort zone will grow. You'll become more comfortable with what you used to not be comfortable with. And so your comfort zone will grow, but that doesn't mean that you still can't get out of it at that point later on in a different area in a different way. So I did want to make sure that I said that this evening. But when I think about these 7 individuals, what was their main calling? Main calling was telling the people of God about God, and really more than that, telling the lost about God. And maybe that's a little different for Job and Moses, but I believe that all of them shared the fact that they were the people of God. And our God has always been a God that needs to be shared with others. Even back in the Old Testament, there was the idea of a proselyte. You could become a Jew by not by heritage, but by proselytizing and converting to Judaism and having God as your one true God. What we're going to talk about tonight is uncomfortable evangelism. And we're going to look at that in 2 ways. And the first one is, it might be a little bit uncomfortable depending on who we share the gospel with. And hopefully we understand from the parable of the soils that the gospel of the seed should be going everywhere, and to all soils, everyone, no matter what they look like. But there's some people that we come into contact with that we might be hesitant to do so with. We might fear in some way something about them. We either fear them or fear what might be said of us by approaching them. I don't know. But the first one that we need to look at is sharing the gospel with a Ninevite. So turn with me to Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and then we'll certainly make application to our lives today. What does a Ninevite look like? But first of all, what did it look like to Jonah? Or what did they look like to Jonah? What did he know them to be? And the story of Jonah begins in verse 1 of chapter 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. And Jonah is one of the few prophets that is told to go outside of the people of God to a Gentile city and to a wicked, very wicked nation. And Jonah's called to go out and cry against it. I think he had some fears. I think he realized that would be in and of itself uncomfortable. And so I think we can at least understand why Jonah didn't want to, in that sense. That there would be a lot of things, but there's more to it in Jonah's case. And look with me in verse 3 and 4. But Jonah arose, right? He did part of what God said to do. He got up, but then he went the wrong direction. He fled to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord sent out a great wind on the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship was about to be broken up, right? And so this is the beginning of Jonah's troubles start when he was headed away from God and away from what God had told him to do. And I'm not here to talk all about Jonah tonight, even though I'd love to do so. But Jonah didn't want to share the gospel with the Ninevites. We find out a little bit of why that is in chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. So when Jonah finally, he's spit out of the great fish, whale thing, sea creature, and God tells him the same message and to go to the same place. And Jonah arose and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, a 3-day journey in extent, and Jonah began to enter the city on the first day's walk, and then he cried out and said, Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. We don't know if that's all he said, but if so, is very effective. Chapter 4, though, verses 1 and 2, but it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. Why would the prophet of God be angry that what happened in between what we just read, chapter 3 and chapter 4, is that the people of Nineveh repented and turned to God. The whole city, starting with the leadership. And Jonah was unhappy about that. It seems like Jonah didn't want them to be saved, didn't think that they deserved to be saved. As far as the story goes, you can see that in God's words to him at the end of chapter 4, right? It just leaves off in this very interesting situation at the end there. But the Lord said, and he's speaking to Jonah, You've had pity on the plant for which you have not labored, nor made it grow, which came up in a night and perished in a night. And should I not pity or really have mercy on Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who cannot discern between their right hand and their left, and much livestock? I think it's irony. Jonah was happy when he was saved from the belly of the fish, from imminent death. But yet he was unhappy when 120,000 people were saved because of God's mercy. Let's make sure we don't look at people like they're Ninevites, like they don't deserve God's mercy, as if we're better than them. Who might we think as a Ninevite today? Maybe a convicted murderer who is currently serving prison time. Do they deserve the gospel? Would it be uncomfortable going into a prison situation and preaching the gospel to them? Absolutely. But is it necessary? I believe so. They're a Ninevite in this category. Or maybe a little bit different view. Someone who's constantly betrayed you, gone against what you stand for as maybe as a Christian or just as a person. You might start to feel bitter towards that person, saying, you know what, they don't need the gospel. Let's make sure we don't get to that point. Let's make sure we're not like Jonah in those areas from chapter 4, where Jonah's mad about our gracious God showing grace to the Ninevites. Or maybe someone that you've never met. You have no idea who they are and what their situation is, but yet they look like they wouldn't be receptive to the gospel. I'm not too sure that they would hear and really be receptive. Who are we to make that kind of judgment? And certainly make a judgment just based upon physical appearances. Let's make sure we share the gospel. Again, none of these things are going to be easy, right? It's going to make us uncomfortable. But that's where we grow. Let's not be like Jonah, and of course, Jonah eventually went and shared the gospel. Let's not be like them if they choose to repent, of course. Secondly, who else might we share the gospel with, or should we share the gospel with? Well, a Samaritan. Go with me to John chapter 4. It's almost impossible, at least for me, to talk about evangelism without going to John chapter 4. I remember this was the first lesson that I gave trying out here. And it's because I love this chapter. In chapter 4, verses 1 through 9, let's just read some of that for a moment and get the picture, remind us of what happens here. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize, but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee, right? He's going from the Judea area up to Galilee, and in between there is Samaria. And he needed to go through Samaria, verse 4. So he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And now Jacob's well was there. And Jesus, therefore, being wearied, a human tired from his journey, sat thus by the well, and it was about the 6th hour, about noonday. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. And Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. And the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" That last part of verse 9, though, because Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. See, the Jews avoided Samaritans, and the phrase is like the plague, right? They avoided Samaritans. They went so far out of their way just to avoid that whole area because they didn't like them, and there's history behind that. But Jesus needed to go through Samaria. He wasn't going to leave anybody, right? The gospel is for all is something we sing and certainly rings true from God's word. And Jesus shows us that even the Samaritans, who were half Jew and half Gentile, basically, they needed the gospel too. And Jesus gave us that greatest example and shows his disciples here. And his disciples are marveling that he's talking with a woman, right? And not just that, but a Samaritan woman when they come back from getting food in the city. So what do I mean by sharing the gospel? How can I share the gospel with a Samaritan today? Share with someone you normally would not interact with. Maybe someone you avoid. Some examples: a practicing homosexual. Maybe you have a business trip to San Francisco or Austin, Texas. You see a pair of people on the bus or train or in a restaurant. Do we share the gospel with them? That's going to be uncomfortable. And we need to be very tactful in how we do such a thing. And I think that rings true for anybody we talk to, but especially in a situation like that. Because we can't assume what they know about the Bible and what they don't. But I believe that would maybe fit into this idea of maybe someone that we avoid, to be honest. What about a member of a denomination? Maybe know that this person doesn't know the truth about the church, and you know that it would just cause issues. Maybe it's your own family member, and you avoid talking about the spiritual aspect of life because it's uncomfortable. I'm telling you, I've been there. It's not going to be easy. You don't want that relationship to go away, but it's necessary. Their soul is worth it. And it might just depend on us, especially maybe a family member. Maybe this fits. Somebody who speaks another language. I don't speak Spanish very well, really at all. I know vocabulary words, and so I remember a lot from high school Spanish 1 and 2. But I don't speak it. I can't just start a conversation with somebody. And so it's very possible that I likely avoid a situation like that, or at least an evangelistic type situation. Not because of who they are, what they look like, but because I just don't think that I can communicate with them. And that might be true in some aspect, but are they not worth me trying to learn a little bit of Spanish? Maybe we learn something that, do you know about the gospel, or figure a phrase out that might help you with this. And I think that maybe we dismiss people too often. Maybe we avoid too many people. We avoid the Samaritans like the Jews did, but Jesus did not, and he's our example. And so we should also share with the Samaritans. I want to look at the way Jesus approached her real quick for a moment. He recognizes that she has a understanding of the law of Moses, right? In the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Samaritans held to. And so Jesus knew that. She quoted really from Deuteronomy 18, verse 50, not quoted, but really insinuated that that prophecy about the Messiah. She says, we know that Messiah is going to come, and when he comes, he'll tell us all things. And Jesus not only knew that, but he knows the history of the Samaritans and the Jews and where they began. So we need to know the history behind some people, and that's going to take a relationship. It's going to take some time. And yes, we don't know everything like Jesus did with this woman here, but we can learn those things. And then what else does he do? He leads her to the Messiah, which was himself. So we're not going to lead someone to ourselves, but in the same way, when we meet a Samaritan, some of the groups that mentioned, how do we get them to Christ? Well, we lead them there, right? We lead them. That's where our goal is, to see Jesus. And Jesus did miracles, and we can't do that. But we can take others through the recorded miracles found in God's word, right? That's exactly what John was writing for. He says, these signs I've written so that you might believe, so that we might help others believe as well. So there's kind of an approach for these people. Number 3, look at Acts chapter 17. We need to share the gospel with those in Athens, or an Athenian, depending on how you might say that. Acts chapter 17. Paul comes into the city of Athens, a place that is given over to idols, verse 16, right? Given over that it said that there were more idols than people in the town. And he walks through Athens and sees that his spirit is provoked within him, verse 15. And therefore he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshipers in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. This was Paul's comfort zone right here. Verse 17, he was in the synagogue with the Jews and Gentile worshipers of God. He would always go, the first place was to the synagogue, because that's where the Jews would be. And he could show the Jews that the old law pointed to the new law. But he gets out of his comfort zone when he's encountered by the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, verse 18. And they took him, verse 19, and brought him to the Areopagus, or Mars Hill, saying, may we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak, right? And they're always looking for some new thing, and that's what Paul would say about them. But this is where Paul steps out of his comfort zone a little bit. He is in an unfamiliar place. Again, he liked to go to the synagogues. Now they bring him out of there. They bring him to a place where they're just Gentiles, and in the sense that they aren't worshipers of Jehovah God. It's a very uncomfortable situation. But what does he do? Verse 22, then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious, or very superstitious, depending on your translation. He says, for as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing him, I proclaim to you. What did Paul do? What was the approach? And so we'll look at that in a moment. But verse 23, that word unknown, to the unknown God, is agnosis, or agnosis, right? Agnostic is the idea. Someone who is doubtful. They aren't sure that this God believes. They're just trying to cover their bases, right? They're just saying, here's an extra idol to a God that maybe we forgot. That's how they were in those days. And so for us, well, this might be to an agnostic, someone who's doubtful. And I believe there's a lot more of those people than we realize. They're not sure about God and if he exists and all of those things. And so what does he do? Where does Paul take them? Look at verse 24. God who made the world and everything in it. Stop right there. He goes to design. That he says, God made the world and everything in it. Someone had to make it. That's where you would go for someone who is agnostic, someone who is doubtful that the God of the Bible exists, or that a God exists at all. And he says, look at design. And you can look at other places like Hebrews 3 and verse 4, where it says every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God, right? We see a house, we see a watch, a car, anything that is designed, and we know that it took design. It didn't just happen by chance. And he says, look at the world around you, right? The world was made by God. There's design in it. We should point people to the design found in the world. And of course, you can look at Psalm 19, verse 1 as well. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. But he also starts with common ground, verse 22. He says, I perceive that in all things you're very religious or superstitious. He says, we have some common ground. You worship something. I worship something too, or someone. Let me tell you more about him. And he says, verse 28, right, and he uses some of their own literature. He knows a little bit about them, at least. And he says, for in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said. And then he quotes one of their own poets, for we are also his offspring. He met them on common ground. That's something that we should do when preaching and teaching those who are in Athens today. Now, lastly, verse 31. Where did he lead them? To the strongest evidence for the gospel. Verse 31, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all. How? By raising him from the dead. Jesus' resurrection is some of the strongest evidence we have, if not the strongest, for the gospel. And he points them to that in order to believe. Number 4, who else do we share the gospel with? Maybe a Judaizer. We meet the Judaizers in Acts chapter 15 and verse number 1, where it says, and certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. That's a definition of a Judaizer in those days, right? And so you see what's happening there. What was Paul's approach? Let's look at his approach, and then we'll look at what that might look like today. Paul's approach, verse 2. There was no small dissension. It says, therefore, when Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and dispute with them, the idea is that he debated with them. What might you do to someone who is teaching error? Maybe set up a debate. I think there's a lot that goes within that. But I think that is seemingly a good way to approach the situation. And that word dispute there in the New King James means this: to engage in intense and emotional expression of different opinions. He was standing his ground, and it was an intense dispute. Not that he was calling names or resorting to anything like that, but it was emotional. But then you also see the approach of Paul and others. It says this in verses 13 and following. They go to the apostles and elders, verse 6. The apostles and elders came together to consider this matter, right? These are the authorities in the church, so certainly go there. Verse 13, and after they had become silent, James answered, saying, men and brethren, listen to me. Simon, speaking of Peter, has declared how God at the first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And with the words of the prophets agree, and with this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written. And he quotes from Amos chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. They went back to the scriptures. How do you deal with someone who is teaching something falsely from the scriptures? You go to the scriptures. That's exactly what they did. And so what might this look like today? Might look like a person who is very religious, that they are all in for God and for the work of God, that they're heavenly involved with their church, but they just don't know what it takes to be a part of the church that's found in the Bible. It would be tough. It would be uncomfortable to talk to someone of that nature. Because I might think, I don't know if I know enough to answer all the questions that they might have. And that's certainly, I think, a logical fear. But it's not a good excuse. Because we can learn, right? And we don't have to answer everything at that moment. We can go back and study just like they did, right? They said, let's take some time, study about this, and then we'll get back to you. And that's exactly what they did. Or maybe they're your friends. And you don't want to sever that relationship. Because when you tell them about the truth, and not tell them, but you show them in God's word what the truth has to say, the truth divides, unfortunately, in one sense. It's unfortunate that it has to do that people choose to not accept the gospel for whatever reason. But a Judaizer might be a friend, it might be someone in the community, it might be a family member who says that they can experience Jesus more while fishing than in a church building. Maybe they say it doesn't matter how we worship as long as we worship the same God. It's going to be uncomfortable when we talk to these types of people. And lastly, this last part goes a little bit quicker, but it's not only who we share it with that might make us uncomfortable, but we need to think about how we share the gospel and see if there's a way that we could do better or do differently that might work better depending on the situation. And so, first of all, you think about our methods. And one method we used just yesterday was door knocking. And I'd like you to turn to Matthew chapter 10, which I'm going to title The First Door Knocking Campaign. Matthew chapter 10. Maybe it's not the first, but at least the first that Jesus institutes. Matthew chapter 10, look at verse 1. And when he had called his 12 disciples to him, he gave them power over unclean spirits to cast them out, to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. And then he goes through who the 12 are. But then look down at verse 5. Then these 12 Jesus sent out and commanded them, saying, do not go into the way of the Gentiles and do not enter a city of the Samaritans, right? The gospel is to the Jew first and then to the Greek. And so he's not saying that the Samaritans and Gentiles don't get the gospel. They will get it later. Verse 6, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. And so then he gives them some specific instructions on how to go about this door knocking method. And he sends them out 2 by 2, right? And they are to go together. They are to shake the dust off their feet if somebody rejects them. I imagine they were a little bit uncomfortable, to say the least, at this time, and doing something like this, because they've already seen parts of Jesus' ministry, but he gives them some new methods, right? Some methods they never had before. And what were those? He gave them power, verse 1, over unclean spirits, to cast them out and to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. I want you to picture this for a moment. You've never been able to do a miracle. You don't have to picture that. You've never been able to do a miracle. But now you have the ability to. And Jesus says, go out and do miracles. When you're trying to do your first miracle, I would be uncomfortable. How do I go about doing this? I'm not entirely sure that this is going to work. I don't know what they're thinking, but I think it's uncomfortable. He gave them some new methods. And of course, these new methods were great and certainly helpful to their situation. I wish we could go about and do that. But the thing is, we have something greater than miracles, and that's God's word, because it's perfect and complete. But verse 28, you see Jesus encouraged them. He says, don't fear, right? He knows they have some fears. But we had some fears yesterday in door knocking. Therefore, do not fear them. Oh, no, verse 28. And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. But rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. He says, don't be afraid of them. Even if they kill you, they can't kill your soul. And then look down at verse 32 and 33. Actually, no, go over to Luke chapter 10 and verse 16. Something that was said while we were reorganizing yesterday and putting together a few more packets after we had been out there door knocking and came back in was exactly this in Luke chapter 10, verse 16. Jesus says, he who hears you hears me. He who rejects you rejects me. When people reject the gospel, they're not rejecting us as people. They might be, depending on maybe if you did it in a way that's not tactful or unloving. But if you did it in the right way, remember that they're rejecting God and not you. And that makes things a lot easier. And I think that made this easier for them, but no less comfortable. Secondly, maybe think about this, spiritual conversations, as we looked at and as Jesus does in John chapter 4, where he just turns an everyday conversation into a spiritual one. And that might be difficult, especially with a stranger. But Jesus gives us that perfect example. John chapter 4, verse 13. And Jesus answered and said to her, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst, right? He turns this into a spiritual conversation. I'm telling you, that's not easy. If you've ever tried, you know. But it's going to be a little bit uncomfortable the first time you do it. But again, remember, as we get out of the comfort zone and grow, then that will eventually become comfortable for us. And he does the same thing for the apostles and the disciples in verse 34, right? He says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me. Stop thinking about physical food for a moment. Let's have a spiritual conversation. That's hard. But secondly, and lastly, not only how you share in your method, you might need to look at something different, but the materials. What did Jesus give them in Matthew chapter 10 and verse number 7, where Jesus said, as you go, preach, saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. At hand, meaning it's going to happen in your generation and very soon. That was not preached before. What was preached before them by the prophets was the kingdom is coming. Just wait for it. And they're preaching the kingdom is about to be here. It is imminent. And so they have new material, really. We don't have new material today in terms of let's make sure we're not straying from this word. And I know everybody understands that, but I want to make that clear. Maybe you have a normal way of going about that material, and it's worked for a long time. Maybe look at a different way. A different study method. There are tons, and I mean many, and you can create your own materials. That might just be a little bit out of your comfort zone, but that's okay. And so with all these things being said, we need to consider tonight, are you and I sowing the seed? Not only growing, but are we sowing? And if we are sowing, then we should be growing, right? It's going to help us grow because the more people that we encounter, the more opportunities to spread the gospel. Remember that we don't need to fear those who will kill the body. And we don't need to fear that maybe I'll lose that family member. Maybe I'll lose that friend. It's worth telling them about their soul. And we can't wait because we don't know when we're going to pass. We don't know when they're going to pass. When all is said and done, Luke chapter 17, verse 10 says, we have done what was our duty to do. That's what evangelism is. It is our duty to do. I hope that this is an encouraging thing for us to do, and that this is a very practical situation, something that I think we can all help each other do throughout the rest of this week, and especially as we have our gospel meeting coming up. That is the easiest excuse to tell people right now. Even if you're in Pampa or Elk City, it's not that far to drive over for our gospel meeting. If you have a need tonight, you need the prayers of the church to pray with you or for you, that time would be now as we stand and sing the song that's been selected.
Years I spent in vanity and pride, caring not my Lord was crucified. Knowing not it was for me He died on Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free. Pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burden soul found liberty at Calvary. My God's word at last my sin I learned. Then I tremble at the law I spurned, till my guilty soul imploring turned to Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free. Pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary.
If you were unable to partake of the Lord's Supper, would you please make that known?
Our hero, the blood, the opportunity to give them the soul supper. Let me take these words, it represents the broken body of Christ and the Christ and the blood. Without that, Father, we thank you for this opportunity to take this Lord's Supper, that we truly line represents the blood of Christ and Calvary. All of you in that faithful day. For us, thank you for your blood.
Last song tonight will be number 666. 666. Before that, we'll have our closing prayer.
Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this beautiful day. We're thankful for you allowing us today to be together in your name and worship your word. Father, we thank you so much for your word and all the things that you give us and the willing that you are to be patient with us and to help us along your way. Father, we're thankful for all the men and women in this church that take their time to prepare lessons for our children and for our adult classes. Father, we're just so thankful for the leadership of this congregation. We ask that you give us the wisdom to use your funds and your name in a manner that pleases you, and give us guidance on what to do and how to do it. Father, help us to always be mindful that it's your will, not ours, that should be done. Father, we thank you so much for the first responders. Thank you for the men and women that take their time daily to do things that we prefer not to do for ourselves. We just ask that you be with them and the decisions they make and help them to live with the decisions they make. Father, we ask that you be with your leadership in our states, our country, our congregation. Because Father, just give us the guidance and the leadership that you want. We ask these things in all.
666.
To the precious